Hi, everyone, and welcome to How Teaching Happens, seminal works in teaching and teacher effectiveness and what they mean in practice book talk. A reminder that chat is disabled for attendees, but if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A feature below. I would like to introduce the authors who have joined us here today. Paul Kirschner is Professor Emeritus of Educational Psychology at the Open University of the Netherlands, guest professor at the Thomas More University of Applied Science in Belgium, and owner of Kirschner Ed. Carl Hendrick holds a PhD in education from King's College London and has taught for several years in both the state and independent sectors. He currently teaches at Wellington College in the UK. Jim Heel is an alum of HGSE's Ed.L.D program and Director of Special Initiatives at Deans for Impact, a US-based nonprofit organization committed to the transformation of educator preparation. Thank you again for joining us, and I will let you go ahead and start your talk. Jim?
Thank you so much, Mayanne, and it's wonderful to be here with you today, whatever time it is and wherever you are in the world. It's particularly nice for me to be back at Gutman, albeit virtually. I spent many a happy hour reading and studying and enjoying in the community of Gutman on Appian Way in my 4 years at the Ed School, both as a master's student and latterly, as Mayanne just said, as a doctoral student. So it's particularly gratifying for me to be here today, and we're really excited to talk to you about the book. When it comes to writing a book, I think it's important to note that there are kind of multiple phases, but at least two of them is, you write the thing and then you get to the end and you see it, I think, with fresh eyes when it's done and it's out in the world. And one of the things that my co-authors and I, Paul and Carl, quickly noticed when we were kind of reviewing what this book meant to us now that it was complete was that we started to notice a kind of a through line, which was the idea of paradoxes that exist within the book, or what we might call the paradox of teaching. So today's talk is going to be about just that. We're each going to introduce and explore some of the paradoxes that we think are at play, and we're going to draw on some of the chapters of the book to illustrate what we mean. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Carl, and he's going to kick us off to explain the paradoxical concepts in a bit more detail.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, and thanks very much to Harvard for extending the invitation. It's a real honor. So I think the first thing to say is that we built this book on a book called How Learning Happens. And that was a book that was really about what Sweller calls cognitive architecture. And a lot of that stuff is fairly to a certain extent, measurable, to another extent, inarguable. So we can think about things like the relatively limited nature of working memory, and we can test those things. This book is really looking at things that are a lot more refined and a lot more difficult to detail. And so when we finished the book, we were looking at a common thread, as Jim said, that went throughout the book. And what we realized was that a lot of what we call good teaching really is about this idea that in order to achieve something, very often you need to do the opposite of what you would think you need to do to achieve those aims. So we're going to talk about 6 individual points. We're going to take 2 points each, and these are based on 2 chapters. So Paul is going to start off with the idea that teachers should make things difficult, but in a good way. And this goes with the second point, which is largely built on Robert and Elizabeth Bjork's work on desirable difficulties. What's good for performance often isn't good for learning. The third point is, and again, lots of these are counterintuitive, they're paradoxical, the idea that activity isn't always productive. I'm thinking also of Robert Coe's claim a few years ago that one of the poorest indicators or proxy indicators of learning is engagement, which is again a very counterintuitive thing. I'm going to talk about PCK, and I'm going to talk about the idea that experts aren't always good at teaching their expertise domain. As Schulman said, it's not just enough to know your subject, you have to know it in several ways. And this is the difference, I think, between an expert and a teacher. A teacher knows things in several different ways that an expert doesn't. Good teachers know what to do when they don't know what to do. And again, the work of Schulman, I think, we actually ended up doing a number of chapters on his work in this book, because I think he's one of the most interesting researchers in the field of this very sophisticated representation of what teachers do. And so I think we're going to go into Paul's first point, which is that teachers should make things difficult, but in a good way.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Carl. Yes, this is the first paradox that we're talking about. I've had contact with Robert Bjork, and in his discussions with him, he says that it's our job as teachers to make things difficult, but make it in a good way. And he did that based upon this idea of desirable difficulties. Here you can see 5 of them. I'll go into them, but I think it's important first to have a little bit of primer about why this is the case. If we look at our cognitive architecture, it's very, very simple. This is a simple model, but it's also very simple. The simple aspect is that at any moment in time, 11 to 12 million bits of information is coming into our sensory memory, and most of it we lose. That which we select goes into our working memory, which is incredibly limited in time and in size. Some of that input is visual spatial, what a word looks like, what an animal looks like, what an object looks like. And some of it is sound, phonological. And that's not only sounds that you hear in the world around you, but also the sounds that you hear when you read aloud to yourself. And these two things interact with each other within your working memory. And if it works well, you organize and integrate that information into your long-term memory. And you're constantly making use of that, digging it out of your long-term memory, bringing it back into your working memory when you need it to carry out a task or to solve a problem. Adam Boxer said it in this way, or actually I bastardized what he said, and that was that the sum of all of the number of times and different ways that you store information, plus the sum of the number of times and the different ways that you retrieve that information, that is what learning and retention is. Now, as I said, Bjork, first Robert Bjork, and then along with his wife Elizabeth, talked about no pain, no gain, would be the typical way of saying it in sports terms. Here you see on the left-hand side how we Dutch train to be speed skaters. And you see on the right how basketball players often train to be able to jump higher than they normally would be able to jump. They've added difficulty to their training to make what happens in the real life world situation a lot easier. And this is the way that Robert Bjork defines it. And you can see it asks for a desirable amount of extra effort, improving long-term performance. And that's the paradox here, or the second paradox actually, and that's what's good for performance often isn't good for learning. Bjork said it in this way. I've learned from the redundancy principle not to read my own slides, so I'll try not to. What's important here are the two bold-faced terms, performance improve and apparent learning, because that's the basis of desirable difficulties. It's about learning. So what is learning? Now, I once wrote in 2006 with John Sweller and Richard Clark that learning is a change in your long-term memory. If your long-term memory isn't changed, then you haven't learned anything. If you can't remember it in a week, a month, a year, you haven't learned anything. That's not to say we don't forget things. We do. But even if we've learned them properly and we forget them after a certain amount of time, it's easier to relearn it. Yeah. It's the residue of thought is what memory is the residue of thought is something that Dan Willingham once said. Performance, on the other hand, is a very temporary fluctuation in your knowledge. It's something, you know, you perform on an exam on Friday morning if you've crammed on Thursday night. You've learned if that which you've learned over a period of time and practiced and stored and retrieved is also available next week, next month, or next year. And that makes it kind of hard because performance is very observable in the long term, but learning is only observable in the long term. Now, Robert Bjork talked about 5 desirable difficulties. Now, 3 of them you've probably all heard of. One is interleaving, and that's that you learn better if you mix different approaches, different types of tasks within an area, like the what's an impressionist, what's an expressionist, what's a pointillist, those types of things. If you don't learn A, then B, and then C, but if you mix them amongst themselves, that we learn better. We don't achieve better 5 minutes after learning it, after studying it, but in the long run, on the test, we do. You also probably know about space practice, that it's better to do something today, review it tomorrow, wait another 2 days, review it again, wait another 2 or 3 days and review it again, each time maybe a half an hour, instead of cramming the night before for an hour and a half. And we know, we often heard about retrieval practice, that's Karpicki and Rudiger, and they talk about instead of reading something twice or 3 times, it's better to read something once and then to test yourself on it, to force yourself to take it out of your long-term memory and bring it into your working memory. The things we don't often see of those desirable difficulties are numbers 2 and 4 here, contextual interference and reduced feedback. Contextual interference is kind of like interleaving, but that's not, you do different types of tasks, all related to the same area, than the area of a square, a circle, a polyhedron, or whatever, but you do it in different contexts. You do it in a school setting, in a work setting, in a task, in a problem setting, those types of things. You interleave the contexts as opposed to interleaving the type of task. And the other one is reduced feedback. We often think we have to give our children, our learners, an incredible amount of good feedback, whereas Robert Bjork says they tend to become reliant on that. They almost become addicted to it. So the best thing we can do is to reduce, to fade our feedback so that the students don't expect us to tell them what it should have been, but make them think for themselves about what it should have been. The next paradox that I'll be talking about, and then I think you're done with me for the rest of the session, is that activity isn't always productive. And that's based upon an article, actually a book from Logan Fiorella and Richard Mayer. It's called Generative Learning Strategies. This is, again, for them, their definition of it. It's important to understand that a generative learning strategy is not just thinking about something or rereading it, but making something new, producing something meaningful beyond the information provided. And they base this upon a model, actually, this model that we already talked about, our cognitive architecture. But in this slide, you see 2 red boxes: select, organize, and integrate. And that's the basis of Logan Fiorella and Rich Mayer's SOE model. And that's called the selecting, organizing, and integrating. You select information that's coming in, you organize it in your working memory, and you integrate it into your long-term memory. Here's an example of that in a map. in a hierarchical map. Here you see selecting the learner focuses on important information, organizes it into a relevant structure, and connects information with the prior knowledge. That is learning. That is generative learning. And just to give you a simple example, you don't have to read this. If you're given a paragraph on steamboats like this, you can read it, you can reread it a number of times, but you can also do this. You can make an outline of it in which you say, well, it's about Eastern style steamboats and Western style steamboats. And one is on this type of river and the other is on this. What you do is you're generating something new. You're generating a chart here. You could do it in other ways. You can make a mind map of this. You can make a summary of it. You can do all different types of things. But what you're doing is you're creating something new on the right-hand side from what you read on the left-hand side. And you can do that while looking at it, but it's better to do it, put it aside, first trying to do it without looking at it, and then looking and see what you've missed. And they've come up with 8 productive strategies. I'm not going to read them all one by one to you. There are a number of things that you probably do with your students: summarize things, self-testing, having them explain it to a peer, to another student. What's important here to understand is that each of these 8 productive strategies is actually a skill, which means it has to be taught and it has to be practiced. It's not enough to say, this is a summary and this is how you should write it. We practice it once. It means you have to practice it in biology, in history, in economics, in art appreciation, in music appreciation, in all of the different things. And then the teacher has to look at it and see if it was summarized properly in order to learn to use it well. If you do that, students will be able to use that strategy to learn better from. And so just to say it again, to be redundant, you select, you organize, and you integrate it in order to learn effectively. And now I'll give the word to Carl.
So a little backstory. A few years ago, Paul contacted me and asked me, was I interested in writing a book on seminal articles in learning? And I said I'd be honored. And he asked me, what papers do you think should be on it? And the very first paper I said is a paper that he wrote called Why Minimally Guided Instruction Doesn't Work. And then when we came to the second book, again, one of the first articles I put forward was something that he had written with Pedro de, and apologies for this, Pedro, but Pedro de Buquier. That's definitely going to be wrong, but I'm going to have to go with that. And it's a paper about authenticity. And the reason I put this paper forward was because I had looked at this paper when I did my PhD, and what I was interested in was trying to make sense of the sort of the magic of teaching, if you like. So we can, again, thinking about what Paul just spoke about there, that notion of cognitive architecture and what we can build upon. Well, as any teacher knows, it's really an arena of chaos. And you've got to make hundreds of decisions in a split second. You've got to explain things, adapt things, modify things, based often on the expression on a student's face. So I read this paper and it was hugely helpful for me in formulating what makes that sort of magic. What is it that turns basic things like subject knowledge or an understanding of how the brain learns into something that comes alive? So this paper is about students' conception of what makes an authentic teacher, which I think is interesting. And there's 4 dimensions to this. Expertise, which is passion. I'll go through them first. Unicity, which is probably the strangest one. And then the final one is distance. And just to touch on them very briefly, the first one is expertise. Now, this is an interesting thing, because if you ask almost any student, they'll be able to tell almost instantly whether their teacher, quote, knows their stuff. But as we'll see in a minute, with Schulman's work on PCK, teachers have to not only know their subject knowledge, they need to know it in different ways. And again, this is the massive difference between an expert and a really good teacher. An expert knows the knowledge, but a teacher has a much more richer understanding of it in terms of how to explain it and how to recognize misconceptions, how to correct things that students might get wrong. There's also an element here, just if you go back to that one, sorry, which is the fourth aspect, but there was also, and just the second quote here I'll read out, not really the way they taught us, but more the way they cared about us. They wanted us to get good marks, wanted us to get our diploma, because they know how important that is. And if you have a problem, then they always make that extra effort to help you. This leads then into the second dimension, which is passion. And again, this is, again, a very slippery thing to talk about, because there's lots of people who are very passionate about things, but they're talking nonsense. But these quotes, I think, are really helpful in thinking about this in the classroom. The first quote here, I think, is really, really interesting. I find this one much more authentic, because she really wants to do something. For instance, if you take football, the coach is simply so passionate about it that he's going to do everything he can to see that you win. That's great to know that they're never going to give up. I think it's great to me among people like that, and that idea that this teacher lives for his subject. So it's not enough just to know what you're talking about. You've got to make it come alive in some way. There's got to be some aspect of animation. The third aspect to this is unicity. And this really refers to the extent to which lessons are unique. And again, this is where the adaptability of teachers, the ability to think on your feet, to change within a second what you're doing, to look around at a room of 30 people and just from their expression, make a decision and go, this isn't working. I need to change into something else. Students also mentioned on this one that they valued the ability for a teacher to digress, that the teacher was more interested in the subject than the lesson plan. The last aspect is distance. Often this is referred to as warm strict. The idea that teachers are able to keep a sort of professional distance between the teachers. So another way of thinking about it is that teachers who are liked are often not trying to be liked. And that sort of positive relationship can often emanate from that. So thinking about this then, and in my own life, I have this vivid memory of being in school and a teacher coming into the classroom, and he seems quite old now in my mind, but he's probably, probably the same age as me. And he came into the classroom with a copy of the Odyssey by Homer. And he just walked in and sort of stood in front of us all. And we were, 17 years of age. This was a course on classic literature. And he held this book up and said, this book is going to change your life. And I've got this vivid memory of him doing this. And he wasn't smiling. It was absolutely burning conviction about this book. And he was sort of shaking as he was saying it. And he then proceeded to explain this book to us and talk to us about it. And as a result of that, then in my own adult life, I was able to make connections between a whole range of cultural things that had a profound effect on my life. And in many respects, I'm probably here today, or I'm a teacher because of that instance. It opened up a radical new world for me. He embodied those four elements for me. I'm going to move on because I think we're getting a bit stuck for time. The next paradox is the notion that experts are not always good at teaching their expertise domain. This is based upon the work of Lee Shulman, Pedagogical Content Knowledge. And there's sort of two questions that he asks really here. One is, what should teachers know, and what should they know how to do? He bemoaned the fact that there was very little what he called richly developed portrayals of expertise. That is to say, the sort of nuts and bolts and what happens in a classroom is rarely portrayed. pedagogical content knowledge is really the intersection between an understanding of how people learn and how to teach it, and then your content knowledge. And that's a very unique thing. That ability to explain Macbeth or explain Newtonian physics is a very sort of unique thing, and they're very different from understanding the content itself. He has a few sort of wonderful phrases. Sorry, Paul, if you go back to that. One of the quotes that really stuck out for me from this paper was that we've got plenty of discussion on the management of pupils in the classroom, but little on the management of ideas. And one of the things he did was he looked at a teacher, an English teacher, who had an extremely powerful understanding of the novel Moby Dick, and he observed them. And what he found was that it was highly unique what this teacher was doing. There was a very sophisticated, sort of rarefied understanding of the novel, and their expectations were different, and they were able to tailor it towards individual students. And this is something that sort of resisted classification, which is again why I get onto this idea of that it's almost a form of alchemy or a form of magic. He's essentially saying that a novice teacher is really relying on, if you like, unmodified subject knowledge, whereas an expert teacher has a very modified and complex understanding of that knowledge. As Michael Polanyi noted in in many times, it's the idea that we know more than we can tell. And this is true, I think, of a lot of great teachers. If you actually ask them, or ask them to sort of systematize what they're doing, they won't be able to tell you. But it's there, and it emanates from what they're doing. One of the things I thought was really interesting in this was the difference between teachers who can teach really well in their subject area, and then what happens to those teachers when they move out of that subject area. I remember when I first started teaching, one of the ideas that was abound was the idea that if you're a good teacher, you can teach anything. Well, we now know that good teaching is highly, highly linked to your subject knowledge and your particular pedagogical content knowledge. And there was one particular teacher who was observed who was teaching, this is a literature teacher, and when she had to teach grammar, and this is one of the things about English teachers, that a lot of English teachers are literature teachers masquerading as language teachers. She looked very different in that lesson. Her interactive style evaporated, and it was replaced with what he called an Admiral Farragut style teaching. If you remember, damn the questions, full speed ahead, where students were not given opportunities to raise questions or offer alternative views. In other words, the less developed this teacher's model and knowledge of what they were teaching was, the narrower their ability to teach it was. I think that's it for me. The next slide is going to be Jim.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Paul. And so as you can see, Paul kicked us off today by thinking about some of the kind of fundamental concepts that underpin, the way that learning happens in a classroom, and the kinds of things that a teacher should be aware of in order to be able to teach according to a way that people learn. And Carl took us through this notion of, yes, but what does that mean when it comes to the disposition of the teacher and the way that they show up into that space? What I'm going to talk about is a chapter that we called The Death of the Teacher, which was a kind of an unashamed play on the death of the author, that famous paper by Roland Barthes from the early 60s, in which he called on a way of reconsidering the author, not as the generator of content, but as someone who invites a reader to generate meaning within a text. And one of the things that we noticed was that in lots of ways, particular approaches to teaching have in some ways sort of rendered the teacher in similar ways as Barthes saw the author, which is to say, you're just there to, quote, create the conditions in which learning happens. And there's a kind of an erasure of the teacher when that consideration is borne in mind. So The paradox that we wanted to try and resolve in this instance was the idea that there is no such thing as something that is entirely teacher-led, just in the same way that there is no such thing as something that is entirely student-centered, but rather good teacher-led instruction can and should be student-centered in nature. So what does that look like? Well, when it comes to the work of Brophy and Good, they spent a decade, or reviewed over a decade of research into the relationship between teacher behavior and subsequent student achievement, and looked at the kind of relativity between the two. And what they found was really, really interesting. If you could advance it, Paul, that would be great. They looked at both teacher effect inputs, in other words, the types of moves that teachers made, and the kinds of teacher effect outputs, the kinds of student achievement that was observed as a result. And one of the primary conclusions that they drew was that rather than being sort of the guide on the side that sort of set the conditions for learning, teachers should and should be unashamed in seeing themselves as conveyors of information, and that conveying of information should be determined by how they structure and sequence ideas. So let's look into what we mean by that. Paul talked earlier about that model of the mind that he showed and of the SOI model. And just to return to that in a different way, it's important to understand how we show up to new information. So as Paul noted, there is everything you could possibly sense in the world. You pay attention to certain things. In this example, you might pay attention to something that appears at least to be a dog. Your brain then goes through a number of episodic and semantic moves to, in a sense, place that new information into a category that is determined by what you already know. So in this instance, dog fits into, it's not a cat, nor is it a bear. It's kind of like a balloon animal dog, but it's not, but it shares certain similarities. And so your schema of dog then becomes the bed within which this new concept of what you've just encountered lives. Your response, which is the final step in this process, is then regulated by the manner in which the new knowledge that you've encountered is organized within the existing prior knowledge or schema that you possess. One of the problems with this is that we often teach in ways that don't acknowledge this schematic process. I've always liked this meme because it says, how to draw an owl. Figure 1, draw 2 circles. Figure 2, just draw the rest of the damn owl. And the assumption there is that it is an assumed leap from the fundamentals and the laying of the groundwork of what an idea is, right the way up to something that is a much more expert and advanced schema that could fill in the granularity and the details and the interrelatedness of those details when it comes to the concept. Much more fitting, of course, would be something closer to this, which acknowledges that you cannot go from a circle to a snail, but rather you must be able to structure and sequence ideas in a manner that is commensurate with the way that learning actually takes place and the way that students and learners encounter new ideas. So back to Brophy and Good. How do they, let's skip forward there, Paul. So let's look at some examples of what this might look like in practice. Brophy and Good talk about overviews and outlines. So let's say you were teaching elementary science and you were teaching the features of a plant or flower. Rather than simply inviting students to sort of list the features of a flower, why not have them present that information to you in concert? That is to say, here are the different parts of the flower, and here is how each contributes to the flower's fundamental processes, say photosynthesis. This is acknowledging that it's not enough simply to say, this is the stamen, these are the petals, but to see them in concert, to see them as part of an interrelated set of concepts that together make a flower a flower. The second that they suggest is rule patterns. So for example, in a history class in high school, you might say, okay, here is what we mean by communism, here is what we mean by fascism. then provide a set of examples of leaders or nations that throughout history that did or did not, to certain degrees, display communist or fascist tendencies. You can then invite the student to use both the rule and the example to take a third step and say, to what extent do these leaders or nations fit in with our conception of what we mean by communism and what we mean by fascism? You hopefully see then again that the notion of the whole and the parts that make up the whole are being presented and sequenced in a way that acknowledges that there's this dance between the pieces and the entirety of the idea. And then the third would be to sort of revisit concepts and associated rules. Some refer to this as sort of spiraling curriculum. And in many ways, when Paul was talking about interleaving earlier on, this is also activated in a similar way. The way to think about this would be, let's say you were teaching elementary math and you started off by looking at place 10 value, but then went on to something more sophisticated. It would be remiss of you not to loop back to place 10 in order to revisit and undergird the learning that's to come. And again, this is not just because of, the notion of a refresher activity or something that's to do with memory, though that's important too. This is also to do with schema and the way in which what that student would come to know as they are building out a more robust understanding of that concept is in turn going to be informed over time by the foundational concepts that continue to play their part in that emerging and developing expertise. Even to Carl's point, teaching is itself, without getting too meta, is an example of how this expertise can be developed. He said earlier about how teachers don't just know their stuff, they know it in many ways. Well, these approaches to teaching are themselves ways to invite students not just to know their stuff, but to know it in many ways. And so how would we reconcile this paradox? Well, this is Brophy good. They said teachers achieve more in classes where they spend most of their, students achieve more in classes where they spend most of their time being taught or supervised by their teachers rather than working on their own. But this is also Brophy good. The teacher carries the content to the students personally rather than depending on the curriculum to do so, but conveys information mostly in brief presentations followed by recitation or application opportunities. And for me, this is where I think the reconciliation of the paradox can happen. Yes, Brophy and Good believe that teachers should teach, but they also believe that teachers' teaching should be the foundation upon which students can start to think for themselves. And for me, this settles a long-held sort of discord and false dichotomy within teaching, that you're either, of the teacher-led corner of the field, or you are in the student-centered corner of the field, and never the twain shall meet. And even something ideological about how you think teaching ought to happen is conveyed by saying whether or not you think the teacher should be at the front leading, or that you think students should be off doing self-directed inquiry. For me, it can and should be both. Students should be should be at the center of their learning, but as the beneficiaries of the learning that is taking place. They should not, and they can't be primarily responsible for the learning that takes place. That is the job of a teacher, but good teacher-led instruction can open up student-centeredness as a fundamental qualitative component of what goes on in classrooms. So I'll kick it back to Carl. He's going to tie us off here and remind us of the teaching paradoxes themselves, and then we'll have a chance to take any questions you might have.
So these are the things that we looked at. I think I'll just go on to the next slide, Paul, because we're just kind of running out of time quickly. And the last kind of point I would sort of leave you with is this, is that teaching really is the most powerful lever we have in terms of, and it's a trite thing to say, but in actually making a difference in kids. And the next slide, I think, Paul, if we just go to that one, yeah. This is yours, Paul, actually, but I quite like this rendering of the difference a teacher makes. If you go back to the other slide, Paul, and it's this notion that, again, one of the final paradoxes that a good teacher is able to apply clear principles in an arena of chaos. And yes, that is a sort of an ineffable thing, but it's also going to be a teacher who is hopefully informed about how people learn things. And then as a result of that, designing instruction and carrying it out based upon that. The last slide then is, well, we've written a book about all this. If you're interested, there are the details. And I think now we're ready for some questions.
Thank you. Let's start with this question. If short-term performance can be achieved while neglecting long-term retention, would you say that worked examples increase performance and that the problems that are responsible for the learning?
It sounded like the question ended middle of a sentence.
Yeah, I kind of realized that after that. If the person who typed in this question would like to retype it, we'll move on to the next one in the meantime.
Okay.
Sorry about that. In addition to audio and visual spatial, how do you account for feelings in the selection from stimuli to working to long-term memory?
I think that's for me. If we go back in history, after we had this model from Atkinson and Schifrin and others, Alan Pavio came with this idea of dual coding, that certain things come in our visual spatial sketchpad, other things are in our phonological loop, and we integrate them in our central executive. But recently he's gone further than that, and he's gone further than that in saying that actually we need to take all 5 of our senses into account. A blind person doesn't have a visual spatial memory, but does remember the braille and can make use of touch in the same way that a seeing person might make use of another sense. We see when we're teaching people to fly planes or drive cars or whatever, we make use of kinesthetic or tactile memory in that. So the idea is just looking at it in terms of 2 memory stores is just a little bit too constricted. And we have to realize the best teaching allows the student to make use of many, if not all, of her or his sensory inputs, because the more these different inputs are related and integrated with each other, the easier it is to remember them, because just the one conjures up the other. A smell can conjure up H2SO4 as a chemical compound, which is the smell of rotten eggs. Yeah.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear how students identify good teachers. Do you think these expectations change depending on the gender of the teacher? Also, did you take gender of teacher into account when conducting your research?
That's going to be Paul again, I think.
Well, I think there's me at the end. Yeah. Well, I'll give an answer to the gender question, and is it different, and then give it back to Carl. Yes, there's been quite a lot of research, and there's even been incredible research as to students receiving the exact same feedback electronically in terms of an email or something like that, in which it's either given by Mary or Carl. And if Carl gave it, it was erudite and helpful. And if Mary gave it, it was bitchy And so there is an incredible gender, what's the word in English? Help me here, please. There's
Bias.
Bias when it comes to looking at teachers or bosses. But Carl, to you about how students perceive of the teachers.
What was the first part of the question again?
Sorry.
It's all right.
There's a lot of questions, so I have to scroll back. Oh, I dismissed it. Okay. The first part of the question is, it's interesting to hear how students identify good teachers. Do you think these expectations change depending on the gender of the teacher?
I don't know. I think that there is a lot of research I know to say that boys, for example, respond differently to male teachers, and particularly some disadvantaged students. But I couldn't really speak about that with authority.
Next question.
Thank you. Are there any teacher prep programs in the US or abroad that, in your view, incorporate most of the principles you've compiled in your book?
Jimmy.
Jim.
Well, this is gonna sadly sound like a shameless plug for the organization that I work for, but nevertheless, these are the examples I encounter every day. That is Deans for Impact's mission to a large degree. We work with over 50 educator preparation programs around the US, and the principal aim is to work with them, durably in deep relationship over time to build on faculty shared understanding of these principles, and then to make them a priority in programmatic design. And so what we've been able to demonstrate is, and we've actually developed a 70-item assessment that captures the extent to which teacher candidates can understand, apply, and even the values that they hold about the efficacy and impact of certain learning science principles on their practice. And we've been able to show that when you work with faculty to really intentionally and carefully weave these kinds of principles more prominently into the work, you see the effect on teacher candidates. And one of the things that's most gratifying of all to see is you ask open-ended questions of teacher candidates at the beginning and the end of their journey. It might be, you're a teacher in a given situation and you have a number of choices at your disposal. Which one would you choose and why? And the "and why" part is always so powerful and moving, because at the beginning of the journey, understandably, you see lots of fair and perfectly sensible guesses around what they think might work. Many of which are really logical and make kind of received sense, but they're not commensurate with what the evidence tells us. By the end of their journey, you could ask them that same question, and we notice a transformation. We see candidates who are soon to be teachers themselves being able to point to the kind of evidence that we've discussed today, but in a way that is activated and active within the choices that they're making as a teacher. And so in large part, we don't want these ideas to just sit on the shelf or in the library of academia. There is a way for them to show up in the daily choices that teachers make. And when you actually see that happening in the real world, it's really exciting to see.
Thank you. For the last few years, we've believed that student engagement is the holy grail. Are you suggesting that the focus on student engagement is somewhat misguided, or is this understanding of good teaching something to be integrated with or layered over student engagement?
I think I'd like to give a first answer to that, if I may, Carl. If you want to, you can, no problem.
Oh, well, Graham Nuttall's book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, is, I think, instructive here. he looked at, sort of mic'd up a lot of students, transcribed what they were saying in lessons. And he found that in a lot of the lessons that were observed, up to 50% of what the teacher was teaching, the students already knew. So now they may have been consolidating knowledge, which is valuable in itself, but they weren't really learning anything. So they had the appearance of learning something. They were very busy, very motivated, very engaged, but they weren't really learning anything. If we go back to that idea about learning being a change in long-term memory, and very often we can see students extremely busy, extremely engaged, but the learning is very low. Another example would be, we now know that one of the poorest way of studying for a test is to underline and highlight material. And I myself spent many years furiously highlighting a book. And this is what Bjork calls the illusion of competence. The feeling that you know it, the sense in which, oh, I know this thing, I've just read through it, but actually it's not retained in long-term memory, it's not usable. So I think that it's what Coe calls a very poor proxy for learning. You go into a classroom and you say, oh, look, they're so busy, they're so engaged, this is wonderful. Well, it's not that simple.
It's important to realize here that what most people understand about the term engagement is that you're physically engaged. You're talking, you're building, you're doing things with your hands in a group or whatever. Engagement is really important, but it's cognitive engagement, that you're engaged in it in your mind, and you can be very silent in that, but be very cognitively engaged. And that's what we want to achieve in students with things like desirable difficulties, with things like generative strategies. We want them to be very engaged with the material, but not physically engaged, cognitively engaged. That's the important difference between what people normally understand as engagement, that which they can see physically in the surrounding, as opposed to that type of engagement that we actually should be trying to achieve in our students, the cognitive engagement.
And I won't add any more, because I would endorse all of that. I just put a link in the chat to an article that Carl and I wrote for a journal of which Paul was editor, and it is entitled "Just Because They're Engaged, It Doesn't Mean They're Learning." And so a lot more on what we mean by the difference between the illusion of engagement and actual engagement in learning could be seen in that article.
Thank you. All right. How much of what you're describing is particular to K through 12 teaching and learning, and how much would you also apply to higher ed teaching and learning?
Exactly, there's no difference. I'm often asked this question, and I can use explicit instruction with 4-year-olds or 44-year-olds. Age isn't important. The two things that are important is prior knowledge. It can be that certain things that you want people to do require a certain amount of prior knowledge. And if they don't have that, they can't do it. If you can't distinguish the wheat from the chaff in what you're reading because you don't understand it properly through a knowledge-rich curriculum or something like that, it doesn't matter if you're 12 or you're 22, you'll have the same problem in that. It could also be cultural differences. The most important things are things like prior knowledge, whether or not you've not only learned the skill, but practiced the skill that you can carry it out. Those are the things that are important. And age is often not one of the most important factors in if something works. If we had time here, I would show you a perfect example of explicit instruction, which people say is only good for higher high school and university students. And that's the way I taught my 4-year-old granddaughter to cross the road.
Thank you. Okay. Do you feel confident that the research findings are rigorous enough? For example, do you believe they're based on sufficiently varied contexts? For example, middle school, senior schools, primary schools?
Who wants to take a poke at this? I
Well,
can, but
I'll start off, Paul, and then you
okay.
can. I think, like, what are the things that we can kind of build upon? And one of the misconceptions about cognitive science is that it's sort of prescriptive, and also that it's a sort of it's a generalized look at learning. So there's things that we can be pretty confident about, which is the limitations of working memory. This goes back to George Miller in the 1950s. This is kind of in no way arguable. And we could argue about things like Geary's work on primary knowledge and secondary knowledge. That's fine. But if we accept that working memory is limited and that long-term memory is relatively infinite, and the extent, as Paul said, the extent to which you have knowledge affects what you understand. There's almost nobody who disagrees with that. That has real implications for instruction and designing instruction, and explaining things to people clearly, checking for understanding, and giving them an opportunity to apply that and use those principles and help them. These are absolutely solid findings. It's also interesting to me, where is discovery learning and inquiry? Where are these things asserted? They're not asserted when you're training brain surgeons. They're not asserted when you're learning how to drive. You don't get in a car and the instructor says, well, the best way to learn is to discover for yourself. So, fire away. A lot of these things are based on, over 100 years of evidence. And a lot of these things are synergistic. So they work together and they build a picture. It's not prescriptive, it's a model, but it's an extremely useful model for how we're never going to get, when I can't see how things, learn, but we can make very strong predictions based on models. Paul.
I can't add very much to that, except to say that much of the research that we've used in the books, if people are talking specifically about that, are things that have been replicated and replicated and replicated. If you're looking at things like desirable difficulties, if you're looking at things like generative learning activities, and you see all the meta research on that, then the only thing you can say is it would be hard to say that it hasn't been replicated and that there isn't very much proof. And if you look at things like John Dudlowski in 2013 about what works and what doesn't work, and that was retrieval practice and space practice, they looked at it in different age groups, in different areas, different types of learning that you have to do, and they found what worked and what didn't. So it's, if you say that this isn't the way you should do it, then that's kind of like saying that a doctor doesn't need to learn anatomy, physiology, and pathology. Those things are also, fairly basic to what you're doing. And that's what this is. This is fairly basic. They're not fads.
And I would just add one more thing on that, which is to say, if we were going to have another general conclusion or through line for the book as a second contender after the paradoxes, it would probably be something to do with Dylan Williams' great quote, which is, everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. Another way of putting that is to say, context is everything. We're not saying that if you copy and paste one of these approaches into your specific context, then suddenly you're going to become a stellar teacher. More to the point, the fact that these are replicable works and ways of thinking about teaching means that they've been seen to have a higher leverage and to work better more of the time. And so if you are interested in making bets around what would be more likely to work more of the time, then these are the kinds of principles that would be a fine place to start.
Thank you. This is a good question. What interesting knowledge nugget did each of you learn from one another?
Well, I learned an awful lot from Paul, from just simply talking through things. And Paul's got a very kind of no-nonsense attention to detail. And everything he says is very carefully filtered through a certain detector. So I think what I learned from Paul is clarity matters, and a kind of a sort of this is, whether you like it or not, this is the case. And sometimes it suits your biases, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think I remember Dylan quoting someone else and saying a mark of a good scientist is someone who can give you something that they accept even though they don't like the findings. So yeah, I've learned that from Paul. From Jim, well, Jim's a good friend of mine for many years, and I've learned a lot of things in terms of knowledge. I think in terms of the book, Jim has done a lot of work on the application of a lot of these principles. So I had kind of read a lot of these papers, and I was very familiar with cognitive load theory and other things, but I think Jim's got a very unique take on, well, how does it work in practice? And he's got a very interesting way of using questions, which is in the book. We originally, Jim worked a lot on having examples, and which we're going to try to do something with. But yeah, the application of the principles of learning, I think he's very good at.
I was going to say the exact same thing about Jim. I'm constantly busy with the content, and the way he kneaded KNEADED, yeah, them into examples, into cases of making use is just brilliant, which was incredible. I think what I learned most and appreciate most from Carl is his reflectivity. We were finished with the book, and we were talking about it and thinking about it, and he was the person who came up with, all of these paradoxes in it, and that a good teacher is capable of bringing order into an arena of chaos, or knows what to do when he or she doesn't know what to do. This incredible, almost philosophical reflectivity on something that for me is often, as he said about me, very clinical and very clear cut. That was one of the joys of working with Carl.
And I can very quickly say that when I think about working with Paul and Carl, and what I took from spending over 2 years, even through a pandemic, writing this book, I think there's long been the definition or the debate around whether teaching is an art or a science. I happen to think it combines the best of both, and I happen to think both Paul and Carl do possess of both. But when I think of Paul, I think of this sort of eloquent, elegant, scientific mind that brings to bear the best that we know about how teaching and learning actually happens to that act. And then when I think of Carl, I think of just a master craftsman, somebody who I've watched teach and shared a corridor of neighboring classrooms with for years, and who really can feel the texture of what teaching actually means between his fingertips and knows it when he sees it. And so I think that both of those insights, I probably reside somewhere in the middle. So maybe I was some kind of moderating factor with the sort of exemplification of this kind of sitting in the middle of that continuum. Who knows? But certainly, but both of those ways of approaching the work, I've been so grateful for, and hopefully, indeed, they are reflected in the book that we created together.
Deeply uncomfortable. Deeply uncomfortable.
Tell me about it.
There's nothing more uncomfortable for a man than listening to another man say nice things about you.
That's the first time I've paid Carl a public compliment in like 25 years of knowing him.
Yeah.
So there you go.
And it'll probably be the last one for the next 25 years.
Whoever asked that question, you really set us up there. So
all right, we still have quite a few questions left, but maybe I'll just select a good one to end with. Can we create curriculum that actually supports the most effective teaching, or is our time better spent in other ways?
The answer is very quick and very simple. Yes. And we need to do it. We need to do it now more than ever. If we want to create good citizens, we need people who know a lot, and based upon that knowledge can be critical consumers of new knowledge that can think about it. And in these moments of, I don't want to get political, it's too easy to get political. But in these times, it's the most important thing we can possibly do.
I would agree with that. I'd also say that it's kind of one leg of a three-legged stool, which is to say, yes, curriculum matters, but I think the way that we prepare teachers in the first place and how they get into teaching, the pathways into teaching and the experiences that they have should be undergirded by these principles. And then once they are in the classroom, the continued professional development, support and guidance and community that they encounter when they're in a school should also be underpinned by this sense of what makes most professions a profession, which is that when you're not sure, or when you are in need of a professional community and North Star that guides the work, there is some common understanding of what makes a teacher, what makes teaching. And in homage to the profession that we all owe so much to, and that we think is the toughest and best job in the world, which is how we start the book. This is our humble offering to see whether or not something could be done to try to lend the profession that kind of integrity and reference to common appreciation, values, and understanding that we think it richly deserves.
Great. Thank you so much for this really important and engaging conversation. And I hope you will come back again for your next book.
Thank you for inviting us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And do follow up if you have any more questions or you're interested in continuing the conversation.
Tweet about it, spread the word. You're working in the greatest profession that exists. Let's make teaching greater.
We might be able to get a hold of these questions, Paul, on your blog. Maybe I can see them there at some point. We could maybe have some quick lines for them.
Okay. Mian, if you'd send them to all three of us, that would be very, very nice.
Absolutely.
And others can follow our blog. Yeah.
Great. I will do that. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.